Hey, welcome to the E2 podcast. Our thanks to CDF Capital for their investment in elders, leaders of the Lord's Church. Today, we welcome Mrs. Laura Dingman, and Laura is the Director of Spiritual Direction at Indian Creek Christian Church in Indianapolis, known as The Creek. Laura is going to be speaking about the importance of lament, the importance of grieving, particularly in this season of many losses because of COVID-19. Join us. She's got many great suggestions for ministry.
Hey everyone, welcome to the E2 Effective Elders podcast. E2 is devoted to coaching your elder team to win by providing biblical and practical resources in authentic relationships. E2 wants nothing more than to equip you to move God's kingdom forward in the place you're serving Jesus. Visit us at e2elders.org and please share this good word with others.
So friends, we are very privileged today to have with us Laura Dingman, and Laura is a longtime friend, and when I had the privilege of serving at the Creek, Laura was on our staff team. She wore many hats, and currently Laura is leading in a very key area, and that area is that of pastoral care. I've invited Laura to come and help us understand this need to lament, to grieve the loss that COVID has brought upon the bride, the church. And so, Laura, first of all, we want to thank you for coming. We're so grateful.
Yeah.
And,
well, thanks for the invite.
You
Happy
betcha.
to be here.
It is a privilege just to see how the Lord has empowered you and called you to serve His bride all these many, many, many years. You've been at the Creek now more than a decade.
Yes, 15 years on staff. And
Wow.
Matt and I, my husband and I, have been members of the church now for 20 years.
Incredible.
So, yeah.
I remember when you, your parents,
Uh-huh.
that whole clan
Yep.
walked through the door many years ago, back in the 1990s.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
Your
grateful
family
to
has
be
been
here.
a huge blessing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, obviously, COVID has not just claimed lives,
Right.
but it has cost people their businesses, their jobs,
Yep.
marriages,
Yep.
ceremonies of celebration.
Yeah.
There's been horrific loss.
Yes.
And one of the things that we at E2 have been urging our partner churches, that when they return to campus, that it's not merely a time of great celebration. It's good to be
Right.
back,
Right.
but there has to be an element to grieve what this has cost people.
Yeah.
And what would you say about lament
Yeah.
in terms of the well-being of an individual?
Well, I think that's really wise advice to give. I think we have to be cautious and really have our ear to the ground about what is happening in the lives of our people and even in ourselves as leaders. I've had to process my own grief through this time and season, things that have been lost, in order to actually walk with other people who are experiencing grief and loss as well. And to just gather everyone together and pretend like nothing has happened is really unwise. So I think to take space to hold what people have lost is really important. I think this isn't something we do normally. We are not a culture that laments.
Right.
It's not something that we're used to doing. I remember going on a mission trip with the worship team several years ago to Israel, and we arrived right after had been a death in the team that is there. That we were going to visit, and it was really interesting. It struck me to see the way they grieved and how different it was than our kind of normal cultural ways of grieving. They shut down. We actually went to a home of the family members, and the men were sitting outside, the women were sitting inside. They don't wear any kind of colored clothes for a period of time. You literally sit. It's the Jewish practice of sitting Shiva. So you literally sit in the home until they approach you, and you just sit with them in their grief. They actually have a coffee that they drink that's more bitter than their normal Arabic coffee. So they're even tasting their grief and encountering it that way. And then I remember going in Jerusalem to the Wailing Wall and just seeing people just pour out, put prayers in the wall and just, literally wailing. And that is just not something that we see a lot of times in our culture. I think we're really quick to move on or move past grief, or we don't really know what to do when a person is grieving, but it's a normal process. And we see one of the places I think we see this in Scripture is in the death of Lazarus. And, I think a lot of times in early, when you're learning to memorize things, you want to memorize that little verse that says Jesus wept, because it's the shortest verse of the Bible. But there's something so profound about it. I think when we sit with that story, we know that if Jesus was fully God, which we know that he was, then he knew what was coming. He knew what was going to happen. He knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. And what he didn't do was tell everyone, you guys just hang on a second. If you'll just wait a minute, I am going to do something miraculous and there will be victory here. And he knew that was coming. But instead of saying that to Martha, and he asks her, I'm the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this? And then he enters into their grief and also allows himself to grieve as well. And we don't know exactly what he was grieving. He could have been grieving the fact that this wouldn't be permanent for Lazarus. He could have been grieving his own upcoming death and what was going to happen there. But what we do know is that he entered into the grief of the people around him, and he made space for it. And this was a part of the Jewish culture. 33% of the Psalms are lament psalms. So this was a part of the Jewish songbook. They knew about this, and that's really not what we take space to do a lot of times. I think it is really important that we live in a place of victory, but I think our culture of productivity maybe, or of moving past or getting to the next thing, that speed, we've missed this place in the middle, and maybe missed allowing God to meet with us.
So in a season like this, why would it be important for us to grieve? In this post-COVID, and really we're not even on the other side of it yet. So many churches are not meeting. What would you share with us the importance, why this is important for such a time as this to lament?
Well, I think if we don't, we're saying something. We're saying that the loss doesn't matter. We're saying that you should move on. This is all behind us now. And I think it's safe to say, I know in our family, and I know even in the people that I'm walking with right now in ministry, that no one is the same. This whole crisis, this pandemic has changed so much. And there's not a single person that I've spoken with that hasn't experienced some kind of loss. And whether it's, the actual death of a loved one, or like you mentioned earlier, the loss of a job, the loss of, and for some people, it's just the loss of a normal rhythm.
I did a wedding last Saturday. And the bride and the groom, they had to pare their guest list down to a very small number.
Absolutely. So I think if we don't pay attention to this and we don't make space for it, then we're actually ignoring what is happening. And I think one of the things that I have found, I can't sit with another person who's grieving if I haven't processed my own grief.
Oh, that's powerful.
If I haven't actually lived in my own, and I think particularly when you're in ministry, you know this, that ministry is a series of losses. Sometimes it's as simple as you work really hard to preach on a weekend and someone doesn't receive it well. It can be as simple as that, to people angrily leaving the church and, walking away, and you've tried everything you can to reconcile it. And, so we have to also name loss in a way that doesn't equal physical death.
Right.
Where we're actually processing, even sometimes change is loss.
Right.
When something is that wasn't the way something was isn't the way that it is anymore. There is some loss in that change. And while there are good things that come with it as well, it's similar to, when we follow the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, through that Paschal mystery. When something dies, God's always bringing something else to new life. But sometimes we don't like to sit in the Saturday.
Yeah, right. No, that's a great point.
We want to get to Sunday really quickly,
right.
but there is something really important that happens in Saturday.
So elders should be, as shepherds of the flock,
yes.
Acknowledging what the sheep are going through.
100%. Yeah.
And they, as you said, they're not going to be able to do that effectively unless they themselves are processing in their own lives what the loss has been.
Yeah. And I think the important thing when we're walking through grief with people is to know, first and foremost, that we don't have to rescue anyone. Jesus is the one who's already done that. And what we need to do is make space. There is a difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy kind of will be the kind of comment where you will say, well, at least it wasn't this. I mean, like, for example, the wedding that you did this weekend, well, at least you got to get married still. Instead of acknowledging and saying, it was probably really hard for some of your very best friends to not be here today. I'm so sorry that happened. And to just acknowledge the loss, regardless of whether we would feel that it was a loss for us. And sometimes depending on our personalities, that may be easier, than others. Some of us really want to move on or reframe a situation, and it's hard for us to sit here, and other people may feel more comfortable with that. But I think that's a really important, listening is so important without fixing.
Wow. Some of us are fixers.
We like to fix things, don't we?
Yeah. Well, and then two, all right, so there's the importance of this. Now, talk about, please, the practical issues. You're a gifted musician. You have led worship for thousands of people. How would a church literally, practically create a moment of lament?
Yeah.
What's that look like?
So I think it can look a couple of different ways. I think if you're going to do it corporately, like in a worship gathering, I think, going back to the Psalms, reading through some of those, I think leading people to understand the difference between complaint and lament is huge. So when you look at the structure of a lament psalm, you see the psalmist bringing the full complaint to God. And then at the very end of it, there is always a, yet I will still praise you.
Right.
Even if I will still praise you. So it's happening within the context of a good God, of a God who is for us and who is working for our good. And I think so as we couch lament, we have to put it in a structure of the goodness of God and in a way that doesn't wipe away the hurt, but that we make space for both things so that we're actually educating and teaching our people how to do this biblically and how to do this in a way that doesn't throw something at God, throw anger at God that isn't his to hold.
When you mentioned that, I thought immediately of two Old Testament moments. Obviously, Job.
Yes. Yep.
Because he says, "I'm not going to curse him. I'm not.
Right.
I'm going to praise the name of my Lord."
Yeah.
And then, secondly, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They say to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Our God is able to save us, but even if He doesn't, yet will we not worship You."
Yes. Yeah.
So it's very powerful.
Yeah. Well, and we see it in the Garden of Gethsemane as well. We see Jesus being completely honest with God about what He wants and saying, if there is any way at all, and not that He wasn't willing to go to the cross, but He's bringing the fullness of His lament. Like, if this could be different, could we please be different?
And when we look at that phrase, may this cup pass from me, it's not that he was unwilling to die. It was
Right.
that cup of God's wrath
Right.
that he had never before experienced.
Right.
And yet he was willing to do so.
Yes. And that moment of surrender
yeah.
is huge. So I think couching lament in a place where, I think about people being able, depending on the size of the church, in some way to be able to voice or write down, even if it's on a piece of paper, that they can bring those things, and that they're not bringing it to the church congregation. We are witnessing, but we're bringing these complaints and laments to God himself.
So like in a worship service, then what you're describing is maybe there's a cross, there's something on the altar, and people are writing and laying
and
it
able
at the
to
foot
bring
of the cross.
it to bring it down.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
And then I think the other piece is having spaces for people who have experienced deep grief and loss to come together and to be listened to and heard, whether that's in a small group setting, where, and maybe even in if you have a small groups ministry, where you're leading your leaders to be able to hold those kinds of things, again, without fixing, but also pointing to the sovereignty of God and the goodness of God, and that we don't separate God's sovereignty from his goodness.
Right.
That we understand and know that.
No, that's good. Again, when you just described that, my brain keeps going back to examples. So in Lamentations, so here's a 5-chapter funeral dirge of Jeremiah over the destruction of Jerusalem.
Right.
And those ever familiar words in chapter 3, because of your great compassion, we are not consumed.
Right. Yeah.
Your mercies never fail. They are new every morning.
Right.
Great is your faithfulness.
Right.
So in the midst of all of their suffering, they focused on the goodness, or he did, of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Powerful. Any final thoughts on what you would share with us as elders? How do we better drive the bus in the lane of lament? Any final words?
I think don't be afraid of it. It'll be messy, might be a little messy, but that's okay. God can be in the mess. I think if you have the courage to step into it, just watch what God will do. I think there will be, when we acknowledge what's been broken, that's when healing can come. And then also, I would say, give space for your staff too, to grieve and lament. So you as elders, you as those who are on staff, give them a space that is safe, that isn't necessarily in front of the congregation, so that they are able to better walk with the congregation as they grieve as well.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, Laura, you've given us a lot of encouragement, and not just encouragement, you have challenged us to be mindful of the wounds that the sheep are bearing right now.
Yeah.
And it's good counsel. So we thank you very much for that. And I'm confident that if you've got questions in this regard, you could reach out to Laura. Just email her, Laura Dingman, Dingman, at the Creek, just like Creek, CREEK.org. And Laura is the leader of an entire team of people on the staff, as well as dozens of volunteers who are ministering to the pastoral needs of people. And God has gifted her for such a time as this. So lead well and lean into Jesus, because he alone is our chief shepherd. Thanks.